My name is Emily Carter. I'm 21 years old, and until last Christmas Eve, I believed that staying quiet was the safest way to survive in my family. That night, my parents sat me down and said it flat out. They were suspending my schooling. No tuition, no housing support, no help at all. They told me it would stay that way until I apologized to their golden child. Not for lying, not for stealing, not for doing anything illegal, just for causing trouble and embarrassing the family. I stood there listening as they explained how my education was a privilege, not a right, how everything they paid for could be taken away with one decision, how this was for my own good. They expected me to argue, to cry, to beg. Instead, I nodded once and said a single word, "All right." That word changed everything. They thought it meant I had given up, that I had finally learned my place, that the problem was solved. What they didn't know was that my room was already half packed, that my future no longer depended on their approval, and that their ultimatum was about to cost them far more than they imagined. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever been controlled by your own family through money, education, or support that could disappear the moment you stopped obeying? If you have, you'll understand exactly why. What happened next wasn't revenge, it was survival. Subscribe, and stay with me until the end, because this story doesn't end the way my parents thought it would. Morning came quietly, not with shouting or confrontation, but with a cold stillness that made everything feel heavier than it should have. The house was awake, yet no one spoke. Plates were set, chairs were pulled out. Routines continued as if nothing had happened, but every movement carried restraint. This was the environment I had learned to function in, a place where control was subtle and silence was expected. In my family, power never needed to announce itself because it was built into everyday life. Tuition payments, housing arrangements, grocery money, all of it was framed as support, but it operated like a switch that could be flipped without warning. As long as I stayed agreeable, the switch stayed on. The moment I questioned anything, even politely, the language changed. Support became a privilege. Help became optional. Responsibility was suddenly mine alone. My parents never called it control. They called it guidance, discipline, doing what was best. But the pattern was consistent enough that I understood it without explanation. My sister never had to navigate that pattern. When problems followed her, they were softened, reframed, or quietly redirected. Deadlines missed were blamed on pressure. Mistakes were described as learning experiences. Someone always stepped in before consequences could fully land. The family story adjusted itself around her, making room for excuses that were never extended to me. I learned quickly that fairness was less important than harmony, and harmony meant not pushing back. When disagreements surfaced, I was the one expected to yield. Not because I was wrong, but because I was more capable of being reasonable. If I raised concerns, I was told to be patient. If I expressed frustration, I was reminded of everything that had been done for me. Over time, that reminder became a boundary I didn't cross. I learned to measure my words, to soften my tone, to decide which thoughts were worth the cost of saying out loud. It wasn't fear that shaped that habit, it was experience. Every time I complied, things stayed calm. Every time I didn't, something was taken away, sometimes subtly, sometimes immediately. I told myself it was temporary, that finishing school would change the balance, that independence would come eventually. That belief made the compromises easier to justify. It also trained me to accept silence as normal. That morning, the weight of it all felt sharper. No one needed to repeat expectations because they were already understood. Control didn't require reminders when it had been enforced for years. As I cleared my plate and moved back toward my room, my phone vibrated once in my hand. A new message sat in my inbox, the sender clearly marked with my university's name, the subject line brief, formal, and impossible to ignore. The first sign that something was off didn't come from a confrontation or a confession. It came quietly through information that wasn't meant for me at all. It started with small inconsistencies I noticed while helping with a routine task that involved shared access to family documents and accounts. The kind of mundane overlap that happens when people assume everything inside a house is interchangeable. At first, I dismissed it as sloppy organization, but the pattern didn't disappear. Files were duplicated with altered timestamps, attachments were renamed, and references appeared where they didn't belong. None of it involved medicine research labs or prestigious institutions, but it was still serious in a different way, the kind of issue that could damage a career built on trust and credentials. My sister's field relied heavily on verified records compliance forms and internal reporting, and the more I paid attention, the clearer it became that something in that system was breaking down. I wasn't looking for dirt, and I wasn't motivated by resentment. I noticed it because my own name surfaced where it shouldn't have. At first, it was subtle. A copied email chain where I was listed as a secondary contact despite having no role there. Then a document labeled as a joint review that I had never seen before. I checked carefully, assuming it was a clerical mistake. But the more I traced it back, the more deliberate it looked. My name was being used to imply oversight approval or collaboration that never happened. That wasn't just unethical, it put me at risk. If questions were raised, if audits followed, my silence could be interpreted as consent. I began saving copies quietly, not to build a case, but to protect myself. The material pointed to data being adjusted after submission credentials presented without proper verification and internal guidelines being bent just enough to pass initial checks. It wasn't dramatic fraud, but it was sustained calculated misrepresentation, the kind that only works when everyone assumes the person involved is untouchable. I understood immediately why the family dynamic mattered here. My sister had always been shielded from consequences, and that protection had extended into her professional life. The same pattern applied: mistakes, softened explanations, rewritten accountability, redirected. I realized that the pressure on me to apologize, to smooth things over, to stay agreeable, wasn't just about family harmony. It was about keeping the surface intact while cracks spread underneath. I didn't confront her. I didn't mention the files or the emails. I watched instead, noticing the way she avoided specifics when talking about work, the way she deflected questions with vague assurances, the tension that slipped through when notifications appeared on her phone. None of this made me feel triumphant or vindicated. It made me cautious. I knew that speaking up too early would only trigger the same response it always did: denial followed by pressure, and then consequences aimed at me for disrupting the narrative. I wasn't ready to be the problem again, so I stayed quiet, collected what I needed, and kept my distance. This wasn't the moment to challenge my parents or expose anything at the table. It was the moment to observe, to prepare, and to decide my next steps, without announcing them. I chose not to confront my family, not yet. Dinner was set the way it always was, on Christmas Eve: plates arranged with care, candles lit, familiar dishes placed where tradition demanded, yet nothing about the room felt warm. The air between us was tight, every movement measured, every sound slightly too loud. My parents sat across from me, composed and expectant, as if this meal were not a family gathering but a meeting with an agenda. My sister took her seat quietly, shoulders drawn and eyes lowered, playing the role everyone knew so well. Conversation never found its footing. Small talk stalled after a few forced attempts, and the clinking of cutlery filled the gaps where laughter used to be. Halfway through the meal, my mother cleared her throat and looked at me, not unkindly, but with the practiced firmness I recognized. She reminded me calmly and publicly of what was required to move forward. An apology spoken clearly offered to my sister in front of everyone. My father nodded along, adding that this was about restoring peace, about doing what was necessary for the family to function again. My sister didn't look up, but her breathing changed, shallow and uneven, as if the moment were physically difficult for her. When she finally raised her eyes, they were glossy, her expression fragile, the picture of someone who had been hurt without ever causing harm. She said nothing, which made it easier for them to see her as the wounded party. I understood then that the words I was expected to say were not meant to address truth, only to confirm a hierarchy. I waited until the table was quiet, then spoke. I apologized for causing tension, for speaking out of turn, for making things uncomfortable. I did not explain myself. I did not defend my intentions. I did not add context or emotion. I said exactly what was demanded and nothing more. My voice stayed even, my posture still. The apology landed where it was supposed to. My parents relaxed almost immediately, the shift visible in their shoulders and their tone. My mother reached for her glass, satisfied, and my father released a breath, as if a problem had been neatly solved. They thanked me for being mature, for understanding what mattered. My sister murmured that she accepted, her voice soft, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a moment the performance held. The tension eased enough for conversation to resume, tentative but hopeful. My parents talked about plans for the next day, about how nice it was to have everyone together again. They believed the issue had been resolved, the balance restored. My sister smiled faintly, though her eyes flicked toward me more than once, searching for something she couldn't quite name. Relief sat on her face, but it was layered with unease, the kind that doesn't disappear just because the script has been followed. When dinner ended, my parents exchanged a look that said they were proud of how they had handled things. They told me they were glad we could move on and suggested we all get some rest. I excused myself without hesitation and went upstairs, closing my bedroom door behind me. The house settled into a quieter rhythm, the sounds of dishes being cleared and low conversation drifting up the stairs. Inside my room, the silence felt different, not heavy, but contained. I sat at my desk, turned on my lamp, and opened my laptop, the screen lighting up the space around me as I prepared for what came next. Once the apology was delivered and accepted, the house slipped into a fragile calm, the kind that only exists when everyone believes the problem has been contained. I didn't feel relief. I felt space. That night, after closing my laptop, I didn't sleep much, not because I was anxious, but because my mind was finally clear enough to act. I wasn't interested in revenge or exposure or proving anyone wrong at the dinner table. What mattered was getting out from under a system that had trained me to stay small and compliant. I began working quietly, using the hours when the house was asleep and the expectations were temporarily suspended. The first step was my education. I submitted a transfer application I had already prepared, keeping Georgetown on the list but shifting programs and timing, so it no longer depended on family support or approval. I updated statements, confirmed transcripts, and finalized deadlines without announcing any of it. There was no drama in the process, just steady completion. I moved on to finances next because independence without resources is just a delayed crisis. I applied for scholarships that didn't require parental endorsement, followed up on grants tied to academic performance rather than family income, and reached out to a campus office about short-term housing options connected to work-study programs. I secured a part-time position that fit around classes, nothing glamorous, just enough to create distance between my future and my parents' accounts. Each confirmation email felt less like a victory and more like a door quietly unlocking. I kept copies, saved records, and built a small buffer of certainty piece by piece. At the same time, I took care of something I had been avoiding. I reviewed the information I had collected about my sister and decided where it actually belonged. I didn't send it out impulsively or scatter it across multiple places. I forwarded what was necessary to the appropriate office connected to her field, without commentary or accusation, only documentation. I didn't explain my motives or ask for outcomes. I understood that once the information was in the right hands, it no longer required my involvement. That wasn't retaliation. It was boundary setting at an institutional level. I finished everything before dawn, moving with a kind of calm precision I had never experienced in that house. By the time the sun began to rise, my room looked different. The walls were the same, but the surface of my life had been cleared. I packed only what belonged to me: books I had bought myself, clothes that fit into one suitcase, documents I would need immediately. Anything tied to family money stayed behind. I didn't leave notes or explanations. There was nothing to clarify. When I zipped the bag and looked around, the room felt neutral, stripped of expectation. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening to the quiet, aware that the shift had already happened, even if no one else knew it yet. The power had moved without announcement. When I turned off the light and closed the door, I wasn't sneaking away. I was stepping forward, and the morning waited on the other side. Christmas morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm that feels borrowed. Light crept through the hallway before the house was fully awake, and for a few minutes everything looked ordinary. I was already up, sitting on the edge of my bed, when the first sound cut through the stillness. It wasn't laughter or music or the soft clatter of breakfast. It was my sister's phone vibrating again and again, the sharp, panicked kind of alert that doesn't stop after one glance. I heard her pacing in the room next door, the quick steps, the uneven breathing, the muffled exhale that came with each new notification. She opened her door and crossed the hall without knocking, her face. Pale eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, as if the room were moving. She didn't sit down. She didn't try to compose herself. She stood there with her phone clenched in her hand and said the words all at once, barely above a whisper. "Please tell me you didn't send it." I looked at her and waited. The question hung in the space between us, heavy and unfinished. Before I could respond, my father's voice drifted up the stairs, cheerful and unguarded, asking if everyone was awake and ready to start the day. He appeared in the doorway moments later, smiling, coffee mug in hand, still wearing the expression of someone who believed the night before had fixed everything. He glanced at my sister and chuckled lightly, assuming this was another bout of holiday nerves. He asked what the problem was, why she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She tried to speak, but stopped, her eyes flicking to me again, waiting. I answered calmly, my voice steady, the words simple. "Send what?" The smile on my father's face stalled, not gone yet, but paused mid-breath. He looked from me to her, then back again, noticing for the first time how tightly she was holding her phone, how her hands were shaking. Her screen lit up again, another message arriving, and this time she didn't hide it. He leaned closer, curiosity edging into concern, asking who was calling so early on Christmas morning. She didn't answer right away. She scrolled, reading, swallowing hard. When she finally spoke, it was fragmented pieces of information slipping out without structure. Official language, requests for clarification, deadlines, the kind of messages that don't come from friends or colleagues looking to chat. My father's posture changed as he listened, his smile dissolving into confusion. He asked me again what she was talking about, what any of this meant. I didn't explain. I didn't raise my voice or offer context. I let the silence do the work. Another alert chimed, then another, each one tightening the space in the room. My sister backed up a step, eyes wide now, realization spreading across her face as the morning caught up with her. She tried to laugh it off, to say there had been a misunderstanding, that these things happened all the time, but the words sounded thin even to her. My father reached for the phone, asking to see it, his tone sharper than before. As he read, his forehead creased, the lines deepening with every sentence. He looked at me again, this time without humor, without certainty. He asked quietly now what I had done. I met his gaze and didn't answer the question he wanted answered. The house felt different then, as if the rules had shifted without warning. My mother's footsteps echoed from downstairs, drawn by the raised voices, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs, sensing something was wrong before anyone spoke. My sister's composure broke completely, her breath hitching as she tried to explain and failed. My father set the phone down slowly, his confidence gone, replaced by the first flicker of understanding that this situation was no longer contained within the family. It was moving on its own. No one asked me to fix it. No one told me to apologize. For the first time that morning, no one knew what to say next, and I stayed exactly where I was watching as the truth began to surface without my help. By the afternoon, the house was no longer the center of what was happening. The consequences arrived from places my family couldn't reach or negotiate with emails from compliance offices, formal notices requesting statements, scheduled calls that didn't ask whether it was convenient. My sister spent hours on the phone, her voice shifting between controlled explanations and panicked pauses, trying to slow something that had already started moving. She was placed on administrative hold, pending review, access suspended credentials, questioned her professional standing reduced to a set of checkboxes waiting for verification. Word spread quickly in her circles not as gossip, but as caution, and the reputation she had carried so easily began to thin. None of it required my commentary. The process was procedural, detached, and relentless. My parents watched it unfold in disbelief, as if the rules they relied on had suddenly changed without notice. They paced, whispered, recalculated. When it became clear that this was real, that it wouldn't disappear with the right tone or a private conversation, they turned to me. They asked if I could explain, clarify, soften the impact, anything to make it stop. They framed it as a family emergency, as something I should help fix because I was involved, because blood mattered, because Christmas was supposed to mean unity. I listened without interrupting, then said no. I told them I wouldn't intervene, wouldn't call, wouldn't write, wouldn't retract anything. I didn't raise my voice or accuse anyone. I stated a boundary and held it. The room went quiet in a way that felt permanent. My mother asked if I understood what refusing meant, how it could affect all of us. I said I did. My father tried another angle, suggesting compromise, damage control, a temporary solution until things cooled down. I declined again. I explained that what was happening was outside the family, now governed by standards and timelines we didn't control. I also made it clear that I was done being the safety net for decisions I didn't make. The realization landed slowly. They saw that the leverage they had used for years no longer applied. Financial threats had no weight. Emotional appeals found no purchase. I had already separated my plans, my schooling, my living arrangements. I told them I was leaving that evening. Not as a punishment, not as a statement, simply as a step that had already been decided. There was no dramatic argument, no final plea that changed anything. I packed the last items that were mine and set my keys on the counter. My sister stayed in her room, avoiding the hallway, the distance between us wider than any argument could make it. I didn't ask for an apology, and I didn't offer one. Forgiveness wasn't on the table, not because I was angry, but because reconciliation would require honesty that hadn't appeared. I walked out before sunset, the air colder than it had been in days, my phone quiet for the first time since morning. The drive away felt steady, uneventful, like the aftermath of a storm rather than the storm itself. I didn't check messages or wait for calls. I focused on the road and the simple fact of forward motion. That night, I slept somewhere else, a temporary place that smelled unfamiliar and felt neutral. In the morning, I woke up early and made coffee in a small kitchen that wasn't charged with history. Outside, the day went on without acknowledging what I had left behind. People walked dogs. Buses ran a store, opened its doors on time. I sat by a window and watched light move across the floor, thinking about schedules and deadlines, about work shifts and classes, about practical things that belonged to me alone. There was no sense of triumph, no speech rehearsed for an audience. There was relief, quiet and unremarkable. The story didn't end with forgiveness or understanding. It ended with distance, with a line drawn and respected, with a life continuing somewhere else. I finished my coffee, picked up my bag, and stepped into the day knowing that whatever followed would be built, without control, without permission, and without going back.